Today's session, we will be starting off with the topic cost sheet. With cost sheet, we will be getting into the numerical aspect of the subject. Okay? With cost sheet, by learning cost sheet, we would be getting into the numerical aspect. We would be learning how cost sheet can be prepared. What are the different parts? What are the different components of a cost sheet? In that note, we will be revisiting some of the basics that we have learned in the previous sessions once again. We will start off with the elements of cost. Now, previously, in the previous session, I'd explained to you the elements of cost. I told you there are three elements of cost: material, labor, expense. We had discussed each of this in detail. I also told you each of these elements of cost can be further divided into direct as well as indirect. Direct as well as indirect. Touching upon the direct cost, if you sum up all your direct costs together, okay, if you add up all your direct costs together, you will get what is called as the prime cost. If you add up all your direct labor, direct material, direct expense, the sum of these three together is called as prime cost. We also saw that each of the element has got an indirect component. You have indirect material, you have indirect labor, you have indirect expense. We had touched upon all this in detail in the previous session. Now, the sum total of all the indirect expenses in a firm, you call that as overhead. Okay? The sum of all your indirect expenses together is called as overhead. In your manufacturing process, you would be incurring these indirect expenses at different stages. So depending on which stage you're incurring this indirect expense, you will end up classifying it as production overhead, administration overhead, or selling and distribution overhead. So what does that mean? At your factory level, if you end up consuming some indirect material, if you end up consuming some indirect labor, if you end up consuming some indirect expenses, if you sum up all that together, that is referred to as production overhead. Now, in terms of your administration, in terms of your office work, if you have some indirect material which is involved, if you have some indirect labor which is involved, if you have some indirect expense which is involved, if you add up all this together, you will get the administration overhead. Now, in terms of making sure that your product or service reaches your end customer, you may have to carry out selling and distribution activities. You will have to carry out some selling and distribution activities. So in the due course of doing this, in the due process of carrying out your selling and distribution activities, if you incur some indirect material, if you incur some indirect labor, if you incur some indirect expense, you add up all this together, you will get the selling and distribution overhead. If you add up all these three together, you will get the selling and the distribution overhead. Okay, so overhead refers to the indirect expenses which are incurred by your business. Depending on which stage you're incurring the indirect expense, you would end up calling it as production, administration, selling and distribution overhead. Okay, you would end up calling it as production, administration, selling and distribution overhead. Okay, so I'll repeat on this once again. If we had touched upon the elements of cost, we saw there are three elements: material, labor, expense. If you end up, and each of these elements can be further classified into three. You have material, you have labor, you have expense. Each of these can be further classified into direct and indirect. If you add up all the direct components together, it is called as prime cost. If you add up all the indirect costs together, it is referred to as overhead. Now, depending on which stage you're incurring this overhead, you would end up classifying it as production overhead, administration overhead, selling and distribution overhead. Now, let's look at this with a different angle. Now, I'll touch upon division of cost once again. First division of cost that we'll be touching upon is the prime cost. Prime cost is the sum total of direct material, direct labor, direct expenses. So you add up all this together, you will get prime cost. But what does your prime cost signify? Let's say the prime cost of your production process is, let's say, like 50,000. What does that signify? It simply refers to the direct expense, the direct cost which is involved by or which is incurred by a business in terms of rendering a service or producing a product. Okay, it refers to all the direct costs incurred by a business in terms of rendering a service or producing a product. Okay. Now, it is very important for the business to calculate the prime cost. Okay. And in fact, if you're a large business, if you're dealing with multiple product lines, it is important for you to calculate, it is mandatory for you to calculate each of the product's prime costs separately or individually. Okay. Why are you required to do this? Why is it necessary for you to do this? It is necessary for you to do this because you have to evaluate and understand which of your product line is generating profit for you. Okay. So let's say, let's pick up on a company like Xiaomi. Okay. Now, they have multiple phone brands. They have Redmi 8, they have Redmi Note 8, they have Redmi 9, they have Redmi Note 9, they have Redmi 9A. So they have multiple product lines. Now, they have to understand what is the direct cost involved in manufacturing each of these phone brand or each of these phone model. Only then the company would be able to compare the sales and see if they are doing well in that particular product line. If they feel they're not doing so well in a product line, what would happen is they may have to end up shutting down that particular product line. So even if you're a large business, it is mandatory for you to calculate your prime cost for various product lines separately. Okay? You will have to calculate the cost of your various product lines separately. So this in a nutshell is what is meant by prime cost. So prime cost is the sum total of all the direct elements of your production process. It involves direct material, direct labor, and then direct expense. With that note, let's look at the divisions of cost from a different angle. So if you add direct material, direct labor, direct expense, you will get your prime cost. This is just what we had touched upon. Okay? This is what is that we have just touched upon. If you end up adding direct material with direct labor, direct expense, the end result that we are getting is your prime cost. Now, to the prime cost, if you add factory overhead, to the prime cost, if you add your factory overhead, you will get factory cost. Now, factory overhead can comprise of indirect material, indirect labor, indirect expense incurred at the factory level. So what could some of these be? So for example, you have some machinery, it is mandatory for you to grease your machinery. Now, if you have to lubricate your machinery, you have to consume grease. You may have to use industrial grease. Industrial grease is an indirect material. Okay? Then to make sure that your laborers who take part in your production activity, they are supervised, you may need a flow supervisor. You may need a foreman. The compensation that you pay to your supervisor is a part of your indirect labor. Now, to make sure that communication between the head office and the factory takes place smoothly, you may have to install a telephone. Now, the telephone bill is a part of your indirect expense. So these three examples that I touched upon, the example of grease, the example of compensation that you pay to your supervisor, the example of the telephone bill that you incur, all these are incurred at the factory level. So you add up all this together, you would get your factory overhead. So that factory overhead, if you sum up with your prime cost, you will get your factory cost. Okay? If you add up prime cost with that factory overhead, you will get your factory cost. Then to factory cost, if you add up your administration overhead, you will get cost of production. To factory cost, you add up your administration overhead, you will get your cost of production. Now, what is meant by administration overhead? At your office, you may consume some indirect material, you may have some indirect labor, you may have some indirect expense. So we'll touch upon this example. For your office work to happen smoothly, it is necessary for you to take a lot of printouts. Now, for printouts, you need paper. Paper is an indirect material. To make sure that all your office employees are working very well, they are functioning as, they are carrying out their responsibilities as instructed to them, you may need an office manager. There's a compensation you have to pay to the office manager. The compensation you're paying to the office manager is an indirect labor. It comes under office. Then you may have to install a telephone as well at your office to ensure the communication is smooth. So now these three examples that I touched upon, that is cost of paper, cost of the office manager, cost of the office telephone bill, all this will be a part of your administration overhead. You add that administration overhead to your factory cost, you get cost of production. Okay, but at this juncture, you have to remember factory cost comprises of your prime cost with your factory overhead, and to that factory cost, you're adding up your administration overhead, you're getting the cost of production. Now, to cost of production, when you add your selling and distribution overheads, that is when you get your total cost. Okay, that is when you get your total cost. So now, in terms of ensuring that the goods and services are made available to your end customer, you may have to provide some. You must have selling and distribution channels. Okay, so at this level, you may end up consuming some indirect material. You may end up having some indirect labor. You may have some indirect expenses. Okay. Now, so for example, it is mandatory for you to give some goodies to your customers. That is a part of your indirect material. You have to pay compensation to your selling and distribution staff, your marketing team. That is a part of your indirect labor. Now, to ensure that there's a smooth communication between a sales team and your back office, your office team, you may have to foot their telephone bills. That is again an indirect expense. So all this will fall under selling and distribution overhead. Now, if you add that with your cost of production, you will get your total cost. Now, at this juncture, what you have to remember is we have calculated the total cost. To this total cost, you have to add your profit margin, you have to add your profit component, and that is where you will be able to determine, you will be able to estimate your selling price. Okay, so to this total cost, you will have to add your profit margin. That is when you will be able to estimate the selling price of your product. Okay. When we work out the cost sheet, it is mandatory for us to remember the structure of prime cost, factory cost, cost of production, total cost. Being management specialists, it is very important, or it is very critical for us to remember this, because this is when we will be effectively able to price our products. Okay, this is when we will be able to effectively price our products. So let me just pick up an example. I will pick up the example of Maruti. Now, Maruti, if you look at Maruti has two major car plants in India. Now, the cars are manufactured at these locations and they get shipped across to the dealers who are spread across India. So for Maruti as a company, for them, the cost that they will be incurring will be until this stage, cost of production. Okay. Now, once the car gets handed over to the seller or the distributor or the dealer, the selling and distribution overhead is incurred by him, by the dealer. Okay, because he will have to either transport the Maruti car from Gurgaon all the way to his location. Then he may have to have a good showroom. He must have staff. He must have incentives for his people. He has to have a back office team, etc. All that. Now, all that is incurred by the distributor. So, if the Maruti car has to be priced effectively, it is important for the company to know that what would be the costs which are incurred at different levels. Only then the car would be able to be priced effectively. Only then the car can be priced properly. Okay? So this is why preparation of this cost sheet is very important for us as management professionals and as students of accounting subject. Now, we will be touching upon this a little bit more in detail when we learn the cost sheet. Now, once we will be touching upon cost center and cost unit once again. We have already discussed this in the previous session, but nonetheless, I'm taking upon this once again because we will look at this with a different approach. Now that we have touched upon the classifications of costs, we have got an understanding about how costing is carried out. We will try and look at this with a different approach. Now, what is a cost center? The main function of cost center is to track, is to monitor the expenses of a business. Okay? One of the most important aspect, one of the most important functions of the cost center is to track the expenses of a business. Now, also, it is the cost center's responsibility to ensure that the expenses are in line with the budget that has been allocated. Okay, so it is the cost center's responsibility to ensure whatever expenses, whatever costs that are incurred by the business, it is in line with the budget which has been allocated. So let's say marketing team, they have been allocated a budget of 1 lakh. HR team has been allocated a budget of 50,000. The operations department has been allocated a budget of 1.5 lakhs. So how do you evaluate this? You would do this in terms of implementing cost centers, and the cost centers would be keeping a track of these expenses. At this juncture, there's one very important thing that you have to remember. Cost center is not responsible for generating revenue. The responsibility, the onus of driving the revenue to ensure that the business has got adequate sales, that this business is selling the right amount of products to make sure that the targets are met. That is not the responsibility of cost center. The cost center's sole responsibility, the sole onus, the sole duty would be to keep a track of the cost. Also, cost center is not responsible for the investment decisions that are carried out. Previously in financial management, you must have learned the concept of the 4 functions of financial management: financing, investing, dividend, working capital. In that line, cost center has got nothing to do with the investment decisions that are taken by the management. The management has decided to start a new factory. It has got nothing to do with your cost center. Management has decided to start a new product line. It has got nothing to do with your cost center. So cost center's sole responsibility is to keep a track of your expenses and then ensure these expenses comply with the allocations that you have carried out. Cost center helps you to ensure that you have operational efficiency. It ensures that you're functioning as per plan. It ensures that you're functioning as per target. It ensures that your expenses are in control, your costs are in control. By ensuring this, you will be able to ensure that your business is able to achieve or is able to meet its profits. It's able to attain its profits. So in a nutshell, this is what is meant by cost center. Now, talking a little bit more, there are 2 types of cost centers. You have production cost center and then you have service cost center. Production cost center, these are cost centers which are involved directly in manufacturing operations. They are directly involved in the manufacturing process. They're associated with the manufacturing activity. Then you have service cost center. Service cost centers, they are responsible, or their responsibility is to support the production cost center. They may not be involved directly in any of these production activities. So, for example, your canteen. Canteen would be a service cost center. Your firm decide to give free food to your employees. Someone has to pay the bill. Okay? So that would be an example of service cost center. Now that we have gone a little bit more in detail, there's one very important aspect you have to remember. Any cost which is incurred by the service cost center, it has to be reapportioned to the production cost center. Now you have to remember, revenue cost center, the service cost centers, they are not involved in the production activity at all. So since they are not involved in the production activity, all their costs has to be borne by the production department. What does that mean? So for example, in your firm, in your business, you decide to give free food to your employees. But the food does not come free. the raw materials, the ingredients that are consumed in terms of manufacturing the food or producing the food or cooking the food, but that will not come free of cost to you. Someone has to pay the bill. Someone has to foot the bill for that. So who will foot the bill for that? To foot that bill, the expenses of cafeteria has to be passed on to the production cost center. So production cost center has to bear that cost. Okay? So this is how the differentiation, the classification of cost centers take place. So cost centers can be broadly divided into two. You have production cost center and then you have service cost center. Production cost center, they are involved in the manufacturing process. Service cost centers, they are responsible for supporting production cost centers. Next, we will touch upon the concept of cost units once again. So cost unit refers to the unit, let me try and put this across in a different way. The total expenditure divided by the total output, it will help you to understand what is your cost unit. Okay, so basically, how much or what was the cost incurred by you in producing 1 unit of that product? Okay, that is what is meant by cost unit. Now, it is important for you to know cost unit because sometimes if you have to price your products effectively, you have to price your services efficiently, it is important for you to know what are the unit costs. So depending on the nature of product that you're dealing with, depending on the nature of service that you're dealing with, the cost units would vary. Now we will touch upon what is meant by cost sheet. Okay. Now we will touch upon what is meant by cost sheet. Simple terms, cost sheet is a statement. Okay. It is a financial statement. It is a statement which conveys some sort of financial information, just like how you have trading account, just like how you have profit and loss account, just like how you prepare balance sheet, just like how you prepare cash flow statement, just how you prepare fund flow statement. It is a statement. It is a financial statement. Now, the statement is responsible for conveying some cost. It is responsible for representing some form of cost. Now, cost sheet helps us to represent what is the cost incurred by your firm. It gives an analogy, it gives a representation of the cost which is incurred by your firm. Also, cost sheet helps you to break down, it gives you a structural representation of the costs which are incurred by a business at different stages. It is a representation of the costs which are incurred by a business at different stages. One very important aspect you have to remember is it is a tabular statement. Just like balance sheet, just like profit and loss account, it is a tabular statement. Now, cost sheet helps you to understand what is the total cost or what is the total expenditure incurred by your firm. Okay, it gives a representation of your total cost or the total expense incurred by your firm. Also, you may end up using your cost sheet to represent it unit-wise. So cost sheet, it gives you a representation of the total cost as well as it gives you a cost per unit. Okay, it gives a representation of both total cost as well as cost per unit. Cost sheet breaks down the cost information element-wise. We touched upon the 3 elements. The 3 elements were material, labor, and expense. And here, the expense is broken down element-wise. Cost sheet, there is no fixed time frame like your balance sheet, where balance sheet has to be prepared at the end of each year. There is no time interval as such. You can prepare your cost sheet as and when required, as and when the need arises, you can go about preparing your cost sheet. So we will look at what is a cost sheet. It is a statement which represents the various costs involved. It gives you an understanding about the total cost incurred at various stages. It gives you a representation element-wise. It is prepared at different intervals. Now, this is the format of cost sheet. Now, if you look at the format, here you have the particulars, then you have the total cost, and then you have the cost per unit. So remember previously when we discussed, we saw that your total, it gives you the representation of the total cost. It also gives you a representation of unit wise cost per unit. Now you start off with direct material, direct labor, direct expense. So if you add up these three together, you would get your prime cost. You add up these three costs together, you would get your prime cost. Now to the prime cost, you have to add up your factory overhead. Now factory overhead comprises of your indirect material, indirect labor, indirect expense. You will get your factory cost. It is also known as works cost. To works cost, if you add your office and admin overhead, you would get cost of production. Cost of production, you would add your selling and distribution overhead, you will get your total cost or cost of sales. Now to the cost of sales or your total cost, you have to add your profit and loss. Just in case if you're preparing your cost sheet well in advance, you will be expecting profit. You have to add your profit margin. When you add your profit margin, you will come to know what should be your sales, what should be your MRP, what should be your selling price. So if you calculate for total cost, you will know how much is your total revenue. If you calculate cost per unit, you will come to know what should be your selling price. This is how a firm goes about preparing a cost sheet, and also for the firm to pool the data, pool the information which is required for the preparation of this cost sheet. It must have cost centers in place. It must have cost centers in place such that all this information can be captured. All this information can be captured. At this juncture, there is one more thing that I would like to touch upon. What are the items which are excluded from the cost sheet? What you have to remember is any financial expense, it is excluded from the cost sheet. Any form of financial expense, it does not get considered as a part of your preparation of cost sheet. It would be considered in your trading account and your profit and loss account. Now, what are some of the financial expenses that your firm can have? So for example, cash discount, interest paid, expenses written off, goodwill written off. All these are referred to as financial expenses. So which means in your cost sheet, you will be considering only cost expenses. You will not be considering financial expenses. So cost sheet preparation may be depending on the nature of the expense, you will decide should you consider, should you not consider. It is not necessary that all the expenses have to be considered as a part of your cost sheet preparation. Only cost expenses are considered. If you come across any financial expense in terms of cash discount, interest paid, etc., these will not be considered as a part of your cost sheet. They would be considered in your income statement. So with that note, we have come to the end of today's topics. We will do a quick recap of what we have previously learned. We started off by learning cost sheet. We touched upon the elements of cost. I touched upon there are three elements: material, labor, expense. You add up, and each of these have got direct and as well as an indirect component. You add up all the direct components together, you get prime cost. If you end up adding all the indirect components, you get the overhead. Again, overhead, you have a three: production overhead, admin overhead, selling and distribution overhead. Then we touched upon division of cost. We saw that we have prime cost. Prime cost refers to the sum total of all your direct elements of cost. Then we touched upon the division of cost. Prime cost, if you add your factory overhead, you get factory cost. To factory cost, if you add admin overhead, you get cost of production. Cost of production, you add your selling and distribution overhead, you get your total cost. Then we spoke about cost center. Cost center helps you to track all your expenses. Then we saw there are two kinds of cost centers: production and service cost center. Because we spoke about cost unit, we saw that the single unit that is produced is referred to as cost unit. It is very important for you to estimate to the cost unit of your goods that are produced. Then we spoke about cost sheet. We saw that cost sheet it's a statement which represents the various costs that are incurred by your business. It gives you a representation of the costs that are incurred at the various stages of your business. It is prepared in a tabular form. It represents the cost element wise. Then we spoke about the format. I had touched upon the format. I gave you an overview of the format of the a cost sheet. Then we touched upon the items which are excluded from the cost sheet. I told you that only cost expenses are considered. Any expense which is financial in nature, it would not be a part of your cost sheet.